Salam alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 239, A Pyramid of Corpses. The following takes place over 33 days in 1221 BCE. In the fifth regnal year of Merneptah, the people of the Nile faced a crisis. Far to the west, in what is now Libya, several tribes had gathered in coalition. Brought together by a charismatic leader, warriors and families alike packed up their homes and started moving east. They were armed, some riding horses and chariots, and they brought animals too, cattle, donkeys, goats, and sheep. The size of this force is a bit uncertain, but based on Egyptian accounts, it may have been as large as 30,000 men, women, and children, an entire population on the move. At the heart of this group was a tribe called Libu, from which we get the word Libya. These people probably lived in the coastal region of Cyrenaica, where seasonal rains supported grasslands for animal grazing and allowed limited agriculture. Unfortunately, times were changing. A drought had begun in the Mediterranean and the Near East. It started around 1250 BCE and slowly built over the next 100 years. Along the coasts, the regular rains may have declined, affecting the grasslands and pasture necessary for herding. The loss of food production put pressure on the existing population and pushed some groups out of their homeland. Fortunately, the Libyan traders and nomads had long reported on the fertility of a land in the east. They spoke of a great river flanked by green fields, which provided abundant grazing land for cattle and plenty of space to settle. Thus, in search of greener pastures, the Libu headed for Egypt. At their head, the coalition leader was a man named Mari, the son of Dedi. Somehow, he had brought other chiefs together under one command. They had gathered weapons and a few allies and set off towards the Nile. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were entirely unaware of this development. In the great city of Pi-Ramesses, the pharaoh Merneptah was ensconced in his palace. He was currently enjoying the adulations of a recent victory. Pharaoh's army had marched east into Canaan, where they defeated foes and sacked cities. Now, the expeditionary force was heading home, crossing the Sinai, and looking forward to a rest. They would get none. In the second month of the Shemu season, around May, a messenger hurried along the roads and waterways of the eastern delta. They were racing towards the great city, Pi-Ramesses, and the palace of Pharaoh. In their hand, the courier brought a message of ill tidings. It is here that our story begins. Quote, Year 5, the second month of Shemu, day 1. A messenger came to tell his person, the king, that the wretched chief of the Libu, Mari, son of Dedi, has descended from the hill country, together with his bowmen, consisting of the best of every fighter and every runner of his foreign land. He brings his wife, his children, the great ones, or chiefs, and every foreign country with him to cross the frontiers. End quote. The news was alarming. The migration of a host, roughly the size of a large city, was cause for great concern. What's worse, Mari and the Libu had gathered allies. Quote, The enemy comes together with the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Akaiwasha, the Luka, and the Tersha. End quote. Merneptah also calls these tribes the foreign peoples of the sea, Na Chasut en Paim. They would later become famous as the Sea Peoples. Some of these groups were familiar to the Egyptians. The Luka, for example, were raiders who had attacked Cyprus and cities in the Levant for the past 130 years. The Sherden, meanwhile, had raided the coast of Egypt itself in the early reign of Ramesses II, episode 209. The great pharaoh had defeated those warriors who, quote, came bold-hearted in warships from the midst of the great green. None could ever fight them. Now, Ramesses' son faced the same threat, renewed with additional allies. The other groups, the Shekelesh, Akaiwasha, and Tersha, were less familiar to the pharaoh. We'll come back to them in the next chapter. For now, let's stay on the desert roads. To reach Egypt, Mari and his followers crossed the Sahara. They could not use the coastal road, for Merneptah's father, Ramesses II, had established a series of fortresses along that border zone. Garrisons would protect harbors, control trade, and watch the movements of peoples. The forts themselves were not large, a couple of hundred soldiers each, and they couldn't withstand the onslaught of a massed tribal movement. But those outposts would give advance warning to Egypt and to its soldiers. To avoid that threat, the Libyans used the desert paths. They traveled between the oases that dot the Sahara west of the Nile Valley. At places like Siwa, Baharia, and Farafra, the Libyans could graze their herds, stop to rest and supply, and avoid that fortified coast. It was a bold strategy, but effective. By the time the Egyptians even knew what was happening, the tribes were already approaching the Nile. Quote, "The enemies are robbing the land's borders. Rebels are attacking it every day. They have reached the highlands of the Oasis region and the district of Ta'ihu, or Farafra. They have entered the fields of Kemet, the Black Land. They have reached the western border." End quote. The news arrived in the palace like a thunderbolt. Upon his throne, Merneptah was furious. As the story goes, Pharaoh rose to his feet and roared his anger. Quote, "Now his person raged like a lion on account of them. He declared, 'Listen to the commands of your lord, so that I may cause you to understand. I am the ruler who herds you, like a father nurturing his foolish children. You are trembling like birds. Do you not know the good deeds of the king's doing?' There was no answer. The pharaoh's fury is a storytelling motif which is quite common in New Kingdom royal texts. Whether it's the Battle of Kadesh, the conflict of Sekenenre and Apep, or Thutmose's Battle of Megiddo, the motif goes that the Egyptian army and the followers are cowardly and trembling in the face of danger, but the king, warrior hero, rises up to chastise them for fear and reassure them of his divine power. In the circumstance, I wouldn't be surprised if Merneptah was genuinely furious at this unexpected invasion. What good were the border fortresses and patrols if an entire host of Libu could approach the Nile Valley undetected? But this is a royal story, and so they include the classic motifs. Pharaoh rages, showing his defiance. His followers tremble in awe. Anyway, you can imagine the courtiers shrinking back as the monarch bellowed and seethed. One of them, perhaps bravely, piped up with soothing words. Quote, "These wretched ones are like crawling things, or animals. Their hearts are different from those of the Egyptians. It is to fill their bellies that they spend the day wandering and fighting. To seek the necessities of their mouths do they come to the land of Kemet. It is like fish upon their bellies that they were brought. Their chief is one like a dog, a wretched man without any heart." End quote. In short, the enemy may be here, but they were animals. The soldiers of Egypt would easily triumph, snaring them like fish, wrangling them like dogs. Pharaoh's rage cooled, and Merneptah regained his composure. The Libyans were here, along with some sea peoples, and the Egyptians were unprepared. Well, it was time to get prepared. Messengers departed the palace, hurrying north, south, and east. Probably not west, they were busy enough. Merneptah summoned his bowmen, his infantry, his charioteers from all parts of the realm. The couriers would take time to reach the more distant strongholds, but those in the north could marshal quickly. The Nile must have bustled with ships sailing downriver, rowing up, and messengers on horseback racing to the outposts. Within days, it would have bustled with warships, carrying their troops, hurrying north. The practical business was started, but Merneptah was still anxious. To reassure his worries and confirm the likely victory, Pharaoh now sought guidance from higher authorities. The king of Egypt spoke to Amun-Ra, king of the gods, seeking his blessing. Soon, Pharaoh reported the god's response. Quote, "Behold, I, Merneptah, am the one to whom the gods give all nourishment." Amun-Ra agrees. Against the enemy, he has turned his back. He does not even look at the land of Libya. End quote. Now, the spiritual and practical preparations were underway. But while the Egyptians scrambled to marshal a response, there was another problem. Mari and his followers were approaching Egypt through the western desert. Using the caravan tracks, they were stopping at the great oases, Siwa, Farafra, Bahariya. Unfortunately, those desert roads offered multiple routes into the Nile Valley. In theory, Mari and his people could go south, using the oases of Dakhla and Karga to approach Upper Egypt and the great cities of Waset or Abydos. Alternatively, they could carry on directly east, using Bahariya to approach the Fayum and its fertile grazing areas. Or, last but certainly not least, they could swing north towards the delta and Men-Nefer, or Memphis. Each path offered its own attractions and would make a perfectly viable route. Merneptah and his generals had to decide, where should they send their troops? To gather information, scouts now fanned out westward. Riding horses, which we often see in art, they would traverse the grasslands and desert tracts until they found that vast cloud of dust that heralded a population and herds on the move. But that would take time, and all the while, the enemy kept marching. Finally, the answer revealed itself. South of Men-Nefer, the great northern city, in the region of the Fayum, the horizon became a sea of people. Mari and his followers were taking, arguably, the safest route, with the shortest gap between water stops and grassland. From the nearest oasis at Bahariya, they had crossed 200 kilometers, or 124 miles. An army might cover that in about 10 days, but this Libyan movement included families and animals. They would have been slow, burdened with valuables. That gave the Egyptians time. In the north, the mustering continued, and Merneptah now took up his role as the defender of Kemet. Quote, "He, the king, was made to sustain mankind, and he arose as king in order to guard the common folk, for there was strength in him to do so. The pick of his bowmen were organized, and his chariots were conducted upon every road. His scouts were in a lively condition, with the king's instructions in their hearts. His soldiers proceeded, together with the auxiliary troops, fair of face, sending the army against every land." End quote. As the Egyptians scrambled to gather their forces, the Libu tribes approached the Nile Valley. At this point, the foreigners would have encountered pyramids. The peaks of ancient monuments towered over the Fayum at Lahun and Lisht, and as they moved north, they would see Dashur and Saqqara. Merneptah's texts even reference this, with a melancholy note. Quote, "It was stormy in the region of the ancestors. Thus all the kings sat in their pyramids, for they had no bowmen to champion them." End quote. I like the implication here that if the ancestors had some troops, they would have come forth to do battle. Would they be ghosts, mummies, or the skeletal undead? Merneptah's phrasing raises a fun mental image of Bronze Age tomb kings. Anyway, the Libyan horde continued north, past the pyramid fields. We don't know if the tribal folk damaged these cemeteries or even plundered tombs. In theory, Merneptah might mention if they had done so, as further proof of their evil. On the other hand, that wouldn't look too good for him, as Egypt's protector. Was he unable to guard even the pyramids? That might be one calamity too far, and worth hiding. Either way, the Libyans passed the great western cemeteries. From their burial chambers, the ancient kings saw the enemy passing, with no Egyptians to stop them. What a disaster! Finally, Mari and his followers saw the gleam of white, the ancient Inbu Hedge, or White Walls of Men-Nefer, known today as Memphis. Just south of modern Cairo and Giza, Men-Nefer was a vast cityscape, its houses, villas, and palaces sprawled amid farmland and canals. At its heart, the great temple of Ptah, Pharaoh's namesake, was one of the oldest and most important sanctuaries in Egypt. Merneptah was particularly fond of this city. In fact, he had commissioned a brand new palace within Ptah's temple, where he could enjoy ceremonies and rituals and look out on his kingdom. Unfortunately, he couldn't visit that palace right now. The enemy did not attack the city directly. In fact, most of the tribal groups carried on north past the metropolis. But Mari and his chiefs may have directed some of their followers to camp near the ancient capital. In one text, looking back on events, Merneptah speaks of, quote, reopening the gates of Men-Nefer. That may be a literary flourish, or it might indicate that part of the Libyan army camped outside the city. They may have besieged the town, or simply taken a defensive position, guarding their comrades who moved further north. Either way, though, Men-Nefer was under threat. The main Libyan and Sea People's force moved on, continuing northward. Their target now becomes clear. They were heading for the Nile Delta, with its numerous waterways and verdant grasslands. Regions like the Wadi Natrun and the western or canopic branch of the Nile would provide excellent grazing areas for their herds and plenty of space for their camps. The Libyans were coming to settle. Meanwhile, the Egyptian forces had finally gathered, probably in the eastern delta. The great royal city, Pi-Ramesses, is the most likely location, based on a contemporary text that describes the city as, quote, the marshalling place of Merneptah's chariots, the mustering place of his army, the mooring place of his troop ships. He has come with his battalions of archers, fierce of face, with burning fingers, who march to battle. End quote. In context, we can imagine the regiments returning from Canaan, garrison troops mustering from the Sinai forts, soldiers from border outposts, and the king's own bodyguard. They assembled in the courtyards and hinterlands of Pi-Ramesses to receive their orders and their supplies. Soon, the army went forth, quote, in order to destroy the land of Libu. They set forth, the hand of God being with them, Amun being with them as their shield. The commander of bowmen was at the front of the force. End quote. As they departed, Pharaoh laid a command upon his troops. Be ready to engage in 14 days. That was a week and a half by Egyptian standards. Plenty of time to reach their destination, about 100 kilometers or 65 miles away. The timeline here is slightly uncertain. We don't know if the Libyans had reached the delta when Merneptah set forth, or if they were still in the region of Men-Nefer. One thing we can say is that the Egyptians probably moved much faster than their foes. They had the home ground advantage, with knowledge of the waterways and the roads. Also, Pharaoh's troops marched as a pure military force. They had no families or animal herds to slow them down. With that in mind, the command of 14 days to engage was possibly quite generous, giving the army plenty of time to fan out across the roads and then rendezvous at their destination. As the campaign got underway, Merneptah may have gone with them. That is uncertain, but he was certainly involved spiritually. The king speaks of a night when, laying down to rest, he dreamed of the looming conflict. Quote, then his person saw in a dream an image of Ptah standing before Pharaoh. The god was like the height of a giant. Ptah handed to Merneptah the sword of victory, and the god said, take this, and you shall banish the troubled heart from yourself. End quote. Just as Amun-Ra had blessed the campaign at its outset, Ptah now intervened to reassure the pharaoh. I like this moment. It feels personal. as if Merneptah was anxious about events and sought divine reassurance. Fortunately, the gods themselves were on Egypt's side. The king could sleep with confidence. The army crossed the delta, winding along roads and waterways. Merneptah does not give us an explicit description of his force. He assumed the audience knew that information, but thanks to art and artifacts, historians can reconstruct a typical army. By this point in history, the Egyptian military had 4 components: infantry, archers, charioteers, and auxiliaries. They were professionally organized, each with a clear role on the battlefield, and in some campaigns, like Ramesses at Kadesh, the armies could number in the tens of thousands. Merneptah's force, though, was probably smaller. Pharaoh had marshaled his army swiftly, with little time for a mass call-up of recruits. Chances are the king went to war with his expeditionary force from Canaan, the garrison troops from Charu and Sinai, and the royal bodyguards from P. Ramesses. A strong force, to be sure, but possibly quite small. The Libu army, meanwhile, may have been as large as 16,000 warriors. The Egyptians would have their work cut out for them. After 14 days, the Egyptian army reached their chosen place of battle. Quote, "Infantry and charioteers prepared before the enemy upon the river bank. They assembled at a place called Per Irer. We don't know exactly where that was, but scholars like Colleen Manassa have concluded it was probably in the southern or western delta, somewhere north of Men-Nefer, perhaps near Abu Rawash or Giza. If that is accurate, then Pharaoh's army marshaled in the shadow of the ancient pyramids. The Egyptians arrived on day 1 in the 3rd month of Shemu, exactly 30 days after news of the invasion had arrived. By the modern calendar, it was now mid to late June. The heat must have been tremendous, humidity rising from the banks and waterways, insects breeding in fetid pools and swarming in damp air. A breeze from the Mediterranean brought some relief, but the soldiers must have sweated under the blazing summer sun. The Egyptians camped at Per Irer for 2 days, waiting for the foe. Mari and his followers were probably skirting the edges of the Nile and Delta. They might stop in the local wadis, old riverbeds, where seasonal grasslands allowed camping and pasture. Again, they likely moved slowly, their huge population crawling along the roads. But soon enough, the warlord and his chieftains learned of the Egyptian presence. On the 3rd day in the 3rd month of Shemu, the wretched chief of the Libu came. The enemy were well armed, foot soldiers wielding metal swords, archers well stocked with arrows, and the leaders even rode chariots. As Merneptah tells it, the Egyptian army took up a defensive position along a riverbank. This wasn't their usual form of combat. The Egyptian chariots benefited from open ground, with plenty of room to maneuver. In the cramped quarters of the delta waterways, that cavalry force would be largely useless. On the other hand, the size of the Libu army, perhaps 10 to 16,000 warriors, was a point of concern. If the Egyptians faced them in an open field, they might be swamped by superior numbers. By holding the fords and river crossings, the Egyptians could force their enemy into unfavorable terrain. Hopefully, this would negate their numerical advantage. Finally, the Libu and Sea Peoples approached, and battle was joined. Quote, "The army of his person, the king, together with his charioteers, went forth, Amun-Ra being with them. He of Nubt, that is, Sutek, was supporting them. The bowmen of the king spent 6 hours destroying the enemy, and in the fighting, the Libu were all put to the sword. They were fallen in their own blood. None of them survived." End quote. In the manner of Egyptian texts, the actual battle is brief. We get a sense of a protracted fight, with archers playing a heavy role in the killing. The combat may have been difficult. The Libu had plenty of bowmen and foot soldiers who wielded long metal swords, and the Sea Peoples, based on later depictions, may have been armored and armed with strong weapons, forming a kind of heavy infantry. That is speculative, unfortunately. Merneptah does not give the details that his father and successors would, but the fact the battle lasted 6 hours suggests a long and difficult fight. For the Egyptians, the infantry formed the core of the battle group. They wielded spears, axes, maces, and the curved swords known as khopesh. A few of them wore armor, like padded linen or metal corselets, but the vast majority were bare skin, relying on large wooden shields covered in animal hides. These foot soldiers would hold the line, guarding the bank and keeping the enemy in place. That would allow the real killers to do their work. In ancient Egypt, it was the bowmen who served as the heavy hitters. In fact, the archers are so iconic to them that the word for bowmen is the same as the word for soldier. In the 13th century, Egyptian archers used composite bows that loosed arrows made of reeds tipped with bone, wood, or copper. The archers could fire upwards in a curved shot that descended upon enemy heads, or they might deploy on the wings so that they could shoot straight and pummel the foe from either side. This combination had served the Egyptians since time immemorial. It had worked then, it would work now. Thirdly, Merneptah had his cavalry. The charioteers, high-ranking officers and courtiers, could serve as mobile fighters and archers. In the actual battle, they seem to have stayed in the rear, perhaps in reserve, but they would come into play if the enemy started to rout. Finally, there were the auxiliaries. Based on art and hieroglyph inscriptions, the Ramessid army employed soldiers from at least 3 different groups. There were the Nubians, favored as archers, Easterners, or Asiatics, who might have served as scouts and skirmishers, and the Sherden, one of the sea peoples. They had come to Egypt in the days of Ramesses II, and promptly been recruited as infantry. Merneptah does not speak of these auxiliaries directly, but contemporary texts refer to his army and its, quote, Sherden, who have plundered the tribes of foreign lands. So we can assume that the army Merneptah brought was a typical Ramessid one, cosmopolitan and heavily armed. Upon the riverbank, the battle raged back and forth. The infantry held the line, defending with their shields and pushing back against the Libu charge. The archers dueled with their rivals across the waterways, and where possible, loosed volleys into the enemy infantry. At the rear and sides, Merneptah's chariots might fire arrows, but mostly stayed out of the melee, and here and there, skirmishers ranged along the riverbanks, guarding approaches and attacking enemies who wandered too far. All arms of the royal army were engaged. The fight dragged on. At last, a breakthrough. The enemy front line faltered, and Libu warriors started to fall back. Then, a panic spread through the ranks, and suddenly the Libu line collapsed. Quote, Their advance guard abandoned their rear guard. Their legs could not hold firm, except to run. Their archers threw down their bows. End quote. As the enemy's front ranks withdrew, the Egyptians saw their opening. They began to cross the river in force, and as the withdrawal became a rout, the chariots came forth and launched their counterattack. Quote, Now the chariot warriors placed themselves behind the enemy to fell them with arrows that were brought to kill. End quote. The Egyptian drivers coaxed their horses to a trot, then to a gallop, then a charge. Wheels kicked up dust as the war carts surged forward, pursuing their foe. Bowstrings twanged, arrows flew fast, striking enemies in the back. Then, as they caught up to the retreating enemy, the chariot warriors drew forth their swords. Unlike the infantry khopesh, the charioteer weapon was a long straight blade. They wielded them like rapiers, stabbing downwards, striking their foes. Blood sprayed from necks and backs. Countless Libu died. Victory was in hand. As his front line crumbled, the Libu warlord Mari retreated. In fact, apparently, he fled. Quote, Meanwhile, when they were engaged in fighting, the wretched chief of the Libu was terrified. His heart was weak. He abandoned his sandals, his bow, his quiver in haste behind him. He took no one together with him. Through his limbs he desired to flee, great terror having encompassed his body. The Libu line collapsed. Merneptah's army charged, and soon they struck the enemy camps. At this point, the narrative turns to plunder, as the Egyptians ravage the enemy supplies, kill or capture their people, and bring them back to Pharaoh. Naturally, the victorious army rejoiced, and when he received news of the victory, Merneptah proclaimed, quote, "Woe to Libu! They have ceased living happily, roaming about in the grasslands. Their wandering was ended in a single day. Sutekh has turned his back on their chief. Their encampments are plundered at the god's word. The great lord of Kemet, power and victory are his. Who can fight knowing how he strides? Foolish and mindless is the one who attacks him. The one who transgresses his borders knows exactly what will happen. Anyone who violates her, that is, Egypt's people, shall not succeed." End quote. As the Egyptian forces fell upon the Libyan tents, chaos engulfed the tribes. The royal narratives speak of troops plundering Mari's own possessions, taking prisoner 12 women, perhaps wives, family, and servants. The Egyptians seized food, weapons, animal, miscellaneous valuables, and of course, people. When all was tallied, Merneptah reported 6,359 Libus slain, 1,200 Akhaiwasha, 250 Shekelesh, 790 Tarsha, an unknown number of Sherden, and then over 9,000 captives from among the Libu people. Pharaoh also claimed spoils, including 128,000 arrows, 8,000 bows, 9,200 swords of metal, 12 chariots, 500 vessels of gold and silver, 3,000 vessels of bronze, 44 horses, 13,000 cattle, goats, and rams, and, quote, all their other property. In short, the Libu coalition was destroyed, its people rounded up, its possessions seized by Pharaoh. Merneptah gloried in the outcome. In one text, he reports, quote, "His person's brave army came to overthrow the wretched chief of the Libu. They are thrust to the ground in hundreds of thousands. All their possessions were seized and brought to Egypt." But the violence was not done yet. The Egyptian troops plundered the enemy camps. They took away the animals, carried off the possessions, and bound thousands of people, children, women, and men, as prisoners. Then, quote, "one set fire to the camp, and the enemy tents were ashes. A few survivors escaped, fleeing up the river valley and down the edge of the delta." Pharaoh says that, quote, "the families of Libu are scattered along the canals like mice. Merneptah seizes them like a kite bird, without missing any. His arrows do not miss the bodies of his foes. Any survivor among them, they live on grass like cattle." On the field itself, the victorious troops stripped the enemy corpses. The narrative says that the Egyptians, quote, "removed a mountain heap of copper, as plunder, from the necks of the enemy," suggesting they were taking necklaces, collars, bangles, and torques. Finally, the Egyptians gathered up the enemy dead. This was a bloody affair. Quote, "Great is the slaughter made among their leaders. These Libu plotted evil against Egypt. But behold, I felled them, I slew them, they being turned into pyramids of corpses." Allegedly, the mounds of enemy dead rivaled the ancient monuments for size. A gruesome image, but still, the king wasn't quite done. In one last report, Merneptah claims that some survivors were executed. Not just killed, but, quote, "put to the stake in the southern part of Men-Nefer." That is, he impaled prisoners along the road leading to the great city. Men-Nefer had been isolated, perhaps even besieged. Now it received its revenge. A line of bodies, speared on posts, would stand quiet witness along the western roads. Any tribes, nomads, or anyone just passing by would see what became of Libu. Merneptah's account takes special note of Men-Nefer. He recalls the city gates being closed in war and then opening after victory, and he says that Mari, the now fleeing Libu chief, was, quote, an abomination to that city, along with his children and his children's children, forever. Speaking of which, what happened to Mari? The Libu chieftain fled westward, abandoning all his possessions. Merneptah describes this at length, with an evident sense of glee. Quote, the wretched chief of Libu fled in the depths of the night, all alone, with no feather upon his head. His feet were bare. Later, quote, a report came from the western fortresses, saying, the enemy, Mari, has gone, having passed by the forts deep in the night, with his bow unstrung. All the gods have laid him low on account of Kemet. The promises which Mari said to his followers, they have failed. All that his mouth spoke has turned upon his own head. End quote. Like a reverse Muad'Dib, the war leader's voice failed and his authority shattered. In the end, Mari, quote, reached his own land, miserable, and every survivor in his land was too angry to receive him. They called Mari the, quote, ruler whom an evil fate has deprived of his feather. In the end, quote, I, Merneptah, caused his tribe to kill him. He is one made into ashes. He was finished off, with the result that the land of Egypt rejoiced. End quote. Mari ran, Mari hid. Mari died. The Libu tribes that he had led to Egypt were shattered, slaughtered, and enslaved. A brutal outcome for the once accomplished leader. Merneptah was confident why the Libu chief had failed. Pharaoh proclaimed, quote, he, Mari, is under the power of the gods. The lords of Men-Nefer and the lord of Kemet have all cursed his name. Mari is an abomination to Men-Nefer, from son to son of his family forever. Thus ended the Libyan invasion. Merneptah's Libyan War unfolded over 33 days in the season of Shemu, northern summer. From day 1 in the 2nd month to day 3 in the 3rd month, the Libu tribes entered the Nile Valley from the west. They passed the oases, the Fayum, the pyramids, and the city of Men-Nefer, before reaching the western delta. Then, on one terrible day, thousands of men, women, and children died to an Egyptian onslaught. As Merneptah tells it, this was a dramatic and potentially calamitous affair. For the first time in centuries, Egypt had been invaded by a foreign force, and this was no skirmish of nomads, no raiding party in the hinterlands. This was a proper movement, tens of thousands strong, descending on the Nile Valley. Though he rejoices in the victory, Merneptah's texts do communicate a hint of shock. The pharaoh's rage at the first reporting of the invasion tells of the rebels who raided borders, despoiled the lands, and plundered food for their own needs. The reference to ancient kings or ancestors sleeping in their pyramids with no champion to defend them strikes a dark tone. These may just be literary devices, escalating the danger to make the victory even grander, but they may speak to a troubled note in Pharaoh's heart. Merneptah references his anxiety, which required the consolations of Amun-Ra and Ptah themselves. For the protector of Kemet, the king of the two lands, the Libu invasion may have seemed disastrous. Like Ramesses at the Battle of Kadesh, Merneptah's account is one of near calamity, narrowly averted through Pharaoh's divine strength. Similarly, the gods themselves get involved. Just as Amun came to Ramesses at Kadesh, empowering his arm to slay foes without number, Merneptah benefited from the oversight of 3 great gods. Amun-Ra turned his back, and thus his light, from the Libu, and Ptah empowered the king and gave him the sword of victory. Then Sutekh abandoned the Libu and supported the Egyptians. That's an interesting wrinkle. In theory, the hinterlands and windswept Sahara were the domain of Sutek, or Seth, and those who lived out there were part of his people. But Sutek was also the patron of Merneptah's family, one of their most favoured deities, ever since Ramesses I and then Seti took the throne. In the hierarchy of desert nomads versus pharaohs, Sutek made the obvious choice. Thus, Merneptah could claim the support of 3 times as many gods as his father had received at Kadesh. Granted, the stakes were higher, the enemy closer to home. But Mari and his followers had made one critical error. They encroached on the domain of the great gods, most notably Men-Nefer, the city of Ptah. Thus, to paraphrase a great author, from the moment the invaders arrived, breathed Egyptian air, ate and drank, they were doomed. That is the tale as Merneptah experienced and recounted it. In hindsight, archaeologists and historians can add further details and context. For starters, the defeat of this Libyan migration was not the end of the crisis. Far from it. Over the next few decades, Egypt and other communities in the Near East would experience a repeated series of shocks. Other migrations were taking place throughout the Mediterranean and Near East, which would affect different communities and cause great upheavals. At home, political instability was on the rise, attacking the very foundations of the pharaonic state. And hanging over all of that was the drought. Across multiple sites, from Spain to Greece to Turkey and the Levant, archaeologists studying pollen, sediment from lakes and marine environments, and archaeological data from settlements have found evidence for an extended drying period. It began around 1250 BCE and lasted at least 100 years before temporarily abating. Such climate shifts were calamitous. A community might cope for a few years, even a decade, but as the drought intensified and the grasslands withered and died, the urge to move became irresistible. The Libyans were not the only population to pack up and leave their homes in this period, but for the story of Egypt, they are the first hint of a massive, generations-long upheaval. To put it simply and dramatically, the collapse was underway. Merneptah and his people would have to weather that storm as best as they could. As the dust settled over the battlefield, Mari and the Libu were defeated. But what about their allies? Next time, we'll take a brief detour to discuss those sea peoples, who now entered the scene properly as invaders. Some of these groups were familiar, and the Egyptians had dealt with them in the past. Others were newcomers on the scene, and it's worth getting to know them a little bit more. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're enjoying the podcast, consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get early access, an ad-free experience, PDF booklets with each new episode, and most importantly, photos and videos of cats, dogs, and lovely animals whom I meet in Egypt and on my travels. Oh, and occasionally we do bonus video content related to episodes, movies, and other topics that I think of. If you're interested in any of that, consider supporting the show at patreon.com/Egypt podcast. I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone that has already subscribed, in particular the priests. These fine folks give most generously every month and help support the gods who calm my anxieties, mostly financial. Special thanks must go to Andy and Chelsea, Mallory, Alicia, Terry, Erjan, James B., Suyon, Eric, Dan B., TJ, Dan S., Jeffrey, Chris, Mycost, C. Yen, Veronica, Kate, Erin, Carlos, Andrew, Farron, Nidin, Yola, Karen, and Linda. Folks, you are all most generous, and I am in your debt. I would also like to thank Co1562, who kindly joined up as a hereditary noble for an entire year. Co1562, if that is your real name, thank you so much for your support. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. May Amun-Ra empower you to go forth in victory. May Ptah calm your anxieties in your dreams. And may Sutekh banish all enemies from your borders, wherever they may be. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.